We have the subject being calm at this point. We can reduce everybody down. We're assessing the situation.
10-4 assessment in progress.
Police have resumed their search of the sprawling woodland this morning, but admit they are becoming increasingly concerned for the missing person's safety. Officers are combing the area on foot, focusing on the muddy terrain near the river.
June 18th, 2001. A 15-year-old girl walked out of her front door in East Tilbury, England. School uniform, backpack, ponytail. Just a regular Monday morning. Her younger brother watched from the window as she walked through the gate, turned left, and headed toward the bus stop. And then, just seconds later, he watched her stop, turn around, and walk the other way. That was the last time anyone in her family ever saw Danielle Jones. She never arrived at school, she never came home. And for the next 23 years, her mother would wake up every single day not knowing where her daughter was. But here's what makes this case extraordinary. Police never found her body. Not a single trace, no crime scene, no physical remains, no location. And yet, the person responsible was convicted, sentenced to life, and the piece of evidence that sealed everything wasn't a fingerprint, wasn't a witness, wasn't a confession. It was a text message. 4 sentences, sent from a missing girl's phone. And the one word buried inside those 4 sentences, a single word spelled in a way Danielle had never once used in her entire life, cracked the case wide open. But here's where it gets worse. The person responsible wasn't a stranger. He was family. He sat at their dinner table. He was in the wedding photos. He showed up at the house 4 to 5 times a week. And for years, he had been leaving handwritten notes in Danielle's bedroom while her family was away on vacation. Personal notes, carefully worded, signed with love. To understand what happened to Danielle Jones, you have to understand who she was, because in true crime, victims are so often reduced to a single photograph, a name in a headline, a case number. Danielle deserves better than that. Danielle Sarah Jones was born on October 16, 1985, in Essex, England. She grew up in East Tilbury, a small, close-knit community where neighbors knew each other by name, the kind of place where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where nothing bad was supposed to happen. She lived with her mother, Linda, her father, Tony, and her 2 younger brothers. By every account from everyone who knew her, Danielle was warm, funny, and deeply loyal to the people she loved. Her mother described her as cheerful and sweet, though not especially confident. She was the kind of teenager who was still figuring herself out, a little shy, a little self-conscious, but surrounded by good friends and completely devoted to her family. She wasn't rebellious, she didn't skip school, she didn't stay out late. She was, by every measure, exactly the kind of young person that parents dream of raising. One of the things that made Danielle genuinely light up was animals. She had 2 pet rabbits that she absolutely adored. Her mother later said those rabbits meant everything to her. Little details like that matter, because they remind us that behind every case file is a real human being, with real joy and real people who loved them deeply. Danielle attended St. Clair's School in Stanford-la-Hope. She was known as a good student and a good friend. She texted constantly, the way teenagers do, and she had a very specific style when she wrote. Always lowercase, always casual, always unmistakably hers. That detail, as small as it sounds right now, is going to become one of the most critical pieces of evidence in this entire case. So hold on to it. On her father Tony's side of the family, there was a man named Stuart Campbell. He was a construction worker based in Grays, Essex, early 40s, married to Tony's sister, and by all outward appearances, He looked like exactly what he claimed to be, a hard-working family man, a devoted husband, a reliable uncle. He was charming. Linda later described him as almost magnetic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately make people feel at ease. He was good with the children in the family. He showed up to gatherings. He was in the photographs. On the surface, completely unremarkable. But Linda also said something else. She said there was always something about Stuart that didn't sit right with her husband. Nothing she could point to directly, nothing that could be called hard evidence, just that quiet, persistent feeling that something was slightly off. Tony felt it too, but feelings aren't proof, and in a family setting, raising concerns about someone without solid evidence doesn't just create conflict, it can permanently destroy relationships. So they said nothing, and Stuart remained exactly where he wanted to be, close, trusted, inside the circle. As Danielle grew older, Stuart's behavior began to shift in ways that were difficult to ignore. He started showing up at the house several times a week. He would meet Danielle at the school bus stop, standing beside his van, visible to everyone, as if he wanted people to see him there. Danielle found it embarrassing. She started pulling away from him. But pulling away from Stuart Campbell was not a simple thing, because Stuart Campbell did not accept distance. He pushed back against it quietly and persistently, in ways that were always just deniable enough to avoid a direct confrontation. Tony later recalled moments where Stuart's behavior around Danielle made him deeply uncomfortable. The way he positioned himself too close to her, the way his attention seemed too focused, the way small interactions felt like something more. But when Tony stepped in, Stuart would smile and deflect. Just casual, just friendly, just an uncle talking to his niece. But it was not casual, and it was not friendly, and it was not what an uncle does. The problem, the real and devastating problem, was that Linda and Tony had no way to prove that. Every incident on its own had an innocent explanation, and every time they came close to raising their concerns, they ran into the same impossible wall. What if they were wrong? What if they said something and it turned out to be nothing? The damage to the family would be irreversible. So they stayed quiet. They watched. They worried. And they hoped that whatever was making them uncomfortable would eventually go away. But what Tony and Linda didn't know, what no one in that family knew, was that Stuart Campbell had been hiding something for nearly 2 decades. Years earlier, Campbell had been involved in a serious incident with a young person. He had faced legal consequences. When Linda and Tony asked about his legal history, they were told it was nothing serious, a misunderstanding, something that had been resolved. They believed it, because why wouldn't they? He was family. But it wasn't a misunderstanding, and it hadn't simply been resolved. What investigators would eventually uncover wasn't a single isolated mistake. It was a pattern, deliberate, calculated, stretching back nearly 2 decades. And at the center of it all, the most recent and most personal target of that pattern was a 15-year-old girl who loved her rabbits, texted in lowercase, and had no idea what was being carefully constructed around her. Danielle Jones trusted her uncle, and that trust, carefully cultivated and deliberately exploited over months and years, is what made what happened next possible. Monday, June 18th, 2001. It was an ordinary morning in East Tilbury. Breakfast on the table, school bags by the door, the quiet rhythm of a family getting ready to start the week. Nobody in that house had any reason to believe this particular morning was different from any other. Danielle left at 7:55 a.m. School uniform, backpack, ponytail. Her bus was due at 8:40, which gave her plenty of time. Her younger brother watched from the window as she walked through the front gate, turned left, and headed in the direction she always went. the same route she had walked dozens of times before. And then just seconds later, he watched her stop, turn around, and walk the other way. That small moment, that one quiet, unexplained change of direction, is the last confirmed image her family ever had of her. A 15-year-old girl turning around on a residential street on a Monday morning. No dramatic bye, no argument, no warning, just a turn. And then she was gone. Danielle never arrived at school. The school contacted Linda mid-morning to ask whether Danielle was unwell. Linda had no idea what they were talking about. As far as she knew, her daughter had left for class hours earlier. That phone call hit Linda like a wall, because she knew her daughter. Danielle didn't skip school, even in the highly unlikely event that something had upset her enough to stay away from class. Danielle would have come home before dark. She was afraid of the dark. She never stayed out late. She always called. The hours passed. The phone stayed silent. Friends and family started calling Danielle's number. They sent messages. They tried again and again. Nothing. No answer. No response. No sign of her anywhere. And for everyone who knew Danielle, that silence was the most unsettling thing of all, because that was not her. That was simply not who she was. While neighbors and relatives fanned out across the area searching street by street, Linda stayed home. She left the front door unlocked. She needed to be there in case Danielle called, in case she walked back through that door and said she was sorry and that everything was fine. Tony drove to his sister's house to look for Stuart Campbell. There was no answer at the door. Tony looked through the window and noticed recording equipment set up in the living room. He couldn't explain why, but it unsettled him. What also unsettled him was something far simpler. While the whole neighborhood was out looking for Danielle, while friends and family were covering every street in East Tilbury, one person was completely absent from that search: Stuart Campbell. Not once did he come outside to help look for Danielle. Not once did he pick up the phone to offer support. He simply wasn't there. And for Tony and Linda, who had been carrying years of quiet unease about this man, that absence communicated something that no words could have expressed more clearly. By nightfall, there was still no sign of Danielle. Linda barely slept. She kept listening for the door, kept telling herself that any moment now she would hear footsteps on the path, and Danielle would come walking in with some explanation that would make all of this make sense. But the night passed, the morning came, and Danielle was still gone. Essex police launched a formal missing persons investigation. Officers arrived with search dogs and began tracing the route Danielle had taken from her front gate. Over the following days, the operation expanded rapidly. Police went door to door across East Tilbury. Search teams moved through fields and open land. Dive teams were deployed to check local waterways. The community responded in a way that was, by every account, genuinely extraordinary. Volunteers showed up in numbers. People shared information freely. Neighbors opened their properties without hesitation. Linda later said the level of public support was almost overwhelming. In the middle of the worst experience of her life, strangers were showing up to help find her daughter. But even with all of that effort, there was nothing. No confirmed sightings, no physical trace, no answers. The case was transferred to a specialized serious crime investigation unit, and the Jones family had already given investigators the one piece of information that would shape the entire direction of this case. They told police about Stuart Campbell. They told them about the van, about the visits, about the couch, about the way he showed up 4 to 5 times a week, about the feeling that had lived quietly inside their household for years without ever finding a name. And as investigators began pulling on that thread, what came back was not a misunderstanding. It was not a man who had made an isolated mistake. What came back was a pattern, deliberate, calculated, and stretching back far longer than anyone in that family had ever imagined. Essex police began examining Stuart Campbell's background in detail, and what they found fundamentally changed the nature of this investigation. Years earlier, Campbell had been involved in a serious incident with a young person. He had pleaded guilty and faced legal consequences as a result. When Linda and Tony had asked about his legal history in the past, they were told it was nothing serious, a misunderstanding, something that had been resolved. They believed it because why would they not believe it? They were family. He was trusted. He was right there in the room. But it was not a misunderstanding, and it had not simply been resolved. Investigators were now uncovering evidence suggesting that this behavior was not an isolated incident. It was a method, a deliberate and practiced system that Campbell had been operating for a significant period of time, one that had affected others before Danielle ever entered the picture. 5 days after Danielle was last seen, just after midnight, Stuart Campbell was arrested. He sat across from investigators and answered their questions with a composure that people in the room would later describe as deeply unsettling. He gave his alibi. He mentioned a home improvement store. He referenced a phone call to his wife. He described helping a neighbor with a construction project. He appeared cooperative on the surface, but gave investigators nothing of substance, and when the questioning moved into more direct territory, he simply stopped responding. In one 20-minute interview, he declined to answer 50 separate questions. Police did not yet have sufficient grounds to hold him, so they released him on bail and placed him under observation. And what they witnessed during that period only strengthened their certainty that they were focused on the right person. Rather than behaving like a concerned relative whose niece had gone missing, Campbell was driving through parking areas and photographing vehicles that matched the description of his own, as if he were building a documented record, as if he knew exactly what was coming and had begun working to get ahead of it. The investigation needed something concrete, something undeniable, something that would close the gap between what investigators knew in their professional judgment and what they could prove in a court of law. They were about to find it. When investigators searched Stuart Campbell's home on Meadow Road, they weren't certain exactly what they were looking for. They had suspicion. They had instinct. They had years of investigative experience telling them that something was deeply wrong with this man. But suspicion is not evidence. They found it. And then they found more. And then they kept finding things that made experienced investigators stop and take a breath. The search began on the ground floor. Officers discovered a substantial amount of photography equipment, professional grade, extensive, the kind of setup that goes well beyond a casual hobby. Alongside the equipment were photographs that Campbell had taken himself of young girls. And in addition to those, investigators found a collection of deeply concerning material involving minors that he had downloaded from the internet. This alone was sufficient to bring separate charges against him, but the search was far from over. At the same time, a search of Danielle's own bedroom produced something that stopped investigators cold. Inside a pencil case in her room, officers found 2 handwritten notes. Campbell had written those notes and placed them in Danielle's bedroom while the entire family was away on vacation. He had entered that room, in that empty house, while her parents were out of the country, and left personal, carefully worded notes on her belongings. Danielle never told her mother, but she told a close friend, and that friend was deeply troubled by it. She couldn't understand how he had gained access to the house in the first place. Campbell had previously carried out renovation work on the property and had installed new back doors. Police never officially recovered a key, but investigators were confident he had maintained access to the property. He had let himself in. He had walked into that girl's bedroom, and he had left those notes because he wanted her to know he had been there. That is not the behavior of a caring relative. That is the behavior of someone who has decided, deliberately and consciously, that the normal boundaries which apply to everyone else simply do not apply to him. But even that was not the most significant discovery made during the investigation. Because while officers were carefully processing everything recovered from Campbell's home, another piece of evidence surfaced that reframed the entire case in a deeply chilling way. Stuart Campbell had been keeping a diary, and the contents of that journal revealed a level of focused attention and preoccupation that went far beyond anything the family had suspected. Campbell had been documenting his interactions with young people, including Danielle. The diary contained entries that painted a clear picture of his methods, a running record of his behavior maintained in his own handwriting over an extended period of time. This was not a man acting on impulse. This was a man who planned, who documented, who kept careful records, who approached his behavior as something to be managed and tracked and refined over time. And Danielle Jones had been at the center of that focused attention for months before she disappeared. The investigation now had forensic evidence. It had handwritten notes left in her bedroom without her parents' knowledge. It had a diary recording his preoccupation in his own handwriting. It had witnesses placing a girl matching Danielle's description near his van on the morning she vanished. And it had an alibi from Campbell himself that investigators were already systematically dismantling. But there was one more piece of evidence, one final detail that would not only confirm everything they already suspected, but would also make legal history in the process. It came from a phone, from 4 sentences, and from one single word, spelled in a way that Danielle Jones had never once used in her entire life. This is where most channels stop. They show you the diary, the hidden notes, the forensic evidence. They move on. But this is true crime buried. And we don't just ask what happened, we ask why. And in the case of Stuart Campbell, the why takes us into one of the darkest corners of criminal psychology, the predator who hides in plain sight. So let's dig in. Stuart Campbell didn't take Danielle Jones because of a single moment of rage. He didn't act on impulse. He didn't snap. He spent months, possibly years, carefully constructing a relationship with her that existed entirely on his terms. He documented it. He controlled it. And when she began pulling away, when she started establishing distance, when the control he had worked so hard to build began slipping, he made a choice, and that choice tells us everything we need to know about who Stuart Campbell is, because predators like Campbell don't see other people as human beings with autonomy and boundaries. They see them as objects to be controlled, and when that control is threatened, they don't let go, they eliminate the threat. But here's what separates Campbell from most predators. He documented everything. The diary, the notes, the carefully maintained record of every interaction. Why? Because for him, the relationship existed as much in his mind as in reality. Writing it down made it real, made it his. It gave him a sense of ownership over something that was never his to own in the first place. And that need to document, that compulsion to construct a permanent record of his actions, is a pattern seen in predators who believe they are smarter than everyone around them. They keep trophies, they keep journals, they keep evidence. Not because they want to be caught, but because they genuinely believe they never will be. And that brings us to the fatal mistake, the one detail Stuart Campbell overlooked. The one unconscious habit he never thought to look for. Hours after Danielle disappeared, something happened that brought the entire investigation to a standstill. A text message was sent from Danielle's phone. Not to her parents, not to her friends, not to any of the people you would expect a frightened missing teenager to reach out to. The message went directly to Stuart Campbell, and it read, "Hi Stu, thanks for being so nice. You're the best uncle ever. Tell Mum I'm so sorry. Love ya loads, Dan," with 3 kisses at the end. For one brief and painful moment, it looked like Danielle might still be alive. Her parents felt something shift inside them when they heard about that message, that desperate, completely human spark of hope that maybe this was real. Maybe she had sent it. Maybe she was out there somewhere and she was okay. But investigators did not feel hope when they examined that message. They felt the case beginning to open up in front of them, because something about that message was wrong. Danielle Jones always texted in lowercase. Always. Without exception. Every message she had ever sent to her friends, to her family, to anyone in her contact list was written in lowercase letters, casual, conversational, exactly the way teenagers communicated in 2001. It wasn't a style choice she sometimes made. It was consistent, documented, verifiable across hundreds of previous messages. It was as personally identifiable as her own handwriting. The message sent from her phone after she disappeared was written entirely in capital letters. That single inconsistency, that one clear departure from a deeply established personal pattern, was enough for investigators to bring in outside expertise. Essex police brought in Professor Malcolm Coulthard, one of the leading forensic linguists in the United Kingdom. His responsibility was to do something that had rarely, if ever, been done in a British courtroom before. He was going to analyze the text message and determine, based on linguistic evidence alone, whether Danielle Jones had actually written it. What Professor Coulthard found was systematic and conclusive. The writing style did not match hers in multiple specific and measurable ways. The phrasing was inconsistent with her patterns. The word choices did not align with her established habits. And then there was one particular detail that rose above everything else. The word thanks was spelled T-H-A-N-K-Z with a Z. Danielle had never once spelled it that way in any of her previous messages. Professor Coulthard went further. He compared the language, the phrasing, and the structural choices in the suspicious message against documented examples of Campbell's own written communication, and what he found was that the message aligned far more closely with Campbell's established patterns than with Danielle's. The vocabulary, the tone, the specific way certain phrases had been constructed. It read, from a purely linguistic standpoint, like a message composed by an adult attempting to replicate the voice of a teenage girl, and not quite succeeding. Because the one detail that would have made the imitation convincing, the consistent use of lowercase letters that defined every single message Danielle had ever written, had simply not been replicated. That was the mistake. One small stylistic habit, so ordinary and so automatic that Danielle never even thought about, and so unremarkable in everyday life that the person attempting to imitate her never thought to look for it. But there was more. Cell phone records showed that at the exact moment the text message was sent from Danielle's phone, both her device and Campbell's device were connected to the same mobile base station. Not a base station near the home improvement store where he claimed to have been in, a base station located in the East Tilbury area, near his home. Both phones, same location, same tower, at the same time. The call that Campbell claimed he had made to his wife on the morning of June 18th, It never happened. There was no record of it anywhere. The call that was supposed to anchor his alibi simply did not exist. And that need to control the narrative, that compulsion to construct the story even after Danielle was gone, is what got him caught. Because he wrote that text message the way he would write it, not the way she would write it. And that one unconscious habit, lowercase versus uppercase, exposed him completely.
October 2002. Chelmsford Crown Court, Essex, England. 16 months after Danielle Jones walked out of her front door and never came back, the man her family believed was responsible finally sat down in a courtroom and faced a jury. The trial lasted 11 weeks, and from the very first day of proceedings, everyone in that building understood one fundamental thing with absolute clarity: there was no body. In the entire history of British criminal law, securing a conviction for murder without physical remains was extraordinarily rare. Stuart Campbell had made certain of that. Whatever had happened to Danielle Jones, wherever she had been taken, she had been concealed well enough that one of the largest search operations in Essex police history had turned up absolutely nothing. And yet, the Crown Prosecution Service had reviewed everything investigators had assembled and made a decision that was, at the time, close to unprecedented. They believed they had enough. The trial proceeded. The forensic evidence was presented. The diary was read in court. The handwritten notes were shown to the jury. Professor Coulthard took the stand and walked them through his linguistic analysis with precision and clarity. Cell tower data was presented showing both phones in the same location at the same time. The fabricated phone call that never happened was exposed. After 11 weeks of proceedings, the jury retired to consider their verdict. When they returned, they delivered their conclusion: guilty. Stuart Campbell was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years before becoming eligible to apply for release consideration. He was removed from that courtroom and taken into custody, and he has maintained his silence about the location of Danielle's remains from that day forward, without interruption. In January 2023, Campbell's application for release was reviewed by the parole board. The decision was returned without extended deliberation. Denied. The reasoning was direct and without ambiguity. Campbell had declined to engage with the process and structured programs that the parole board requires. He had spent 2 decades in custody maintaining the same posture he had adopted from the moment of his first arrest: uncooperative, uncommunicative, offering nothing of substance to anyone asking anything of genuine importance. And the parole board examined that record and concluded, entirely reasonably, that a man who had consistently refused to engage with the assessment process and who continued to withhold the location of a missing person was not someone who should be permitted to return to free society. Linda Jones opposed the release application publicly and without reservation. She said that until Stuart Campbell disclosed the location of Danielle's remains, he should remain exactly where he was. That position was not driven by a desire for ongoing punishment as an end in itself. It was the statement of a mother who had one remaining request, one final thing she was asking for. Tell me where my daughter is. That is all. After everything, after more than 20 years, just tell me where she is. Campbell said nothing. But Linda Jones had not spent those years simply waiting for institutional processes to resolve themselves. She had taken the experience she carried and directed it outward in a way that would ultimately reach far beyond her own family situation. In 2019, Linda publicly aligned herself with a campaign calling for new legislation that would become known as Helen's Law.
The campaign had been led with extraordinary persistence and dedication by a woman named Marie McCourt, whose daughter, Helen, had been taken from her in 1988. Helen's remains were never located, and the man responsible, Ian Sims, had maintained his silence for decades. Marie McCourt had spent those same decades advocating for a legal framework that would require the parole board to formally include a person's refusal to disclose the location of a victim's remains as a weighted consideration in any release determination. The campaign gathered more than 600,000 formal signatures of support, and in November 2020, Helen's Law received formal royal assent and became part of the established legal framework of England and Wales. The legislation does not create an absolute barrier to release consideration for individuals who decline to provide location information, but it requires the parole board to treat that refusal as a formally weighted factor in their deliberations. It establishes in law what common decency had always suggested should be true, that choosing to conceal the location of a person's remains from the family who needs that information is not a neutral, private decision. It is an ongoing act with ongoing consequences, and those consequences should be reflected formally in how the justice system responds to requests for freedom from the person making that choice. Linda Jones had helped bring that outcome into existence. A woman navigating one of the most sustained and unresolvable forms of grief imaginable channeled that experience into legislative change that would offer future families a measure of protection from the same specific cruelty she had lived with for over 2 decades. That contribution is not a footnote. It is a significant and lasting achievement.
Danielle Jones was 15 years old. She loved her rabbits. She texted in lowercase. She was afraid of the dark. She left notes for her mother when she went to a neighbor's house. She always called when she arrived somewhere. She was shy and funny and warm and completely devoted to the people she loved. She deserved so much more than what she received. And she deserves to be remembered as exactly who she was, not only as a name in a case file, not only as a subject in a true crime documentary, but as a person, a real, full, irreplaceable human being whose absence has left a space in the world that nothing and no one has ever been able to fill. Remember her name. This is True Crime Buried. We don't just tell you what happened, we dig deeper to find the why. 2 questions for the comments. 1. Stuart Campbell has been denied parole twice. Should he ever be released if he continues to refuse to tell Linda Jones where her daughter is? 2. Danielle's case changed the law forever. Helen's Law now protects other families. Does that legacy change how you see this case? Drop your answers below. If you want the deepest breakdowns of the psychology behind the crime, hit subscribe. New case every week. We've only just started digging. I'll see you in the next one.